SpaceX just IPO'd at a $1.77 trillion valuation, making it the biggest IPO in history, making Elon Musk almost the world's first trillionaire. But how do I think this affects the stock market and the crypto market? Because there's been a lot of talk that the launch of SpaceX could potentially mark a top in equities. And there's also been a lot of talk that there could potentially be a crypto rotation as people FOMO into SpaceX. So in today's video, I'm going to be sharing my full honest thoughts on all of that, how I think it affects the market, how it changes my thinking around the market for the next few months. And I'm also going to be running you through all of the valuation data surrounding SpaceX and sharing my entire trade plan and how I'm thinking about trading SpaceX in the context of my portfolio. We're going to go through the valuations, we're going to go through the math, we're going to go through the risk reward. And by the end of the video, I think you'll be really well equipped not only to trade SpaceX, but also manage the rest of your portfolio. Remember, this video is not financial advice. It's just my opinions. You obviously have to do your own research and make your own investing decisions. But let's get straight into things here. So we did see a period in the pre-market trading on Hyperliquid where it was doing really well. Then we ended up having a big sweep to the downside, hitting $155. It rocketed before launch back up to $185. And now on launch, we are seeing a slight correction. It's probably also a reflection of a lot of investors that entered the pre-market also closing their positions, the classic, buy the rumor, sell the news trade, which makes sense as to why we're seeing a slight dip today. So I'm just going to be sharing a bunch of my honest thoughts, and then we're going to see if the data actually backs up my thoughts. So the first thing to be aware of with SpaceX is that it's very low float. Only roughly 4% of the stock is live on the first day of trading, which is today. And we've seen this play out in crypto many times before, essentially when a token will launch with a low float and a very high fully diluted valuation. And this is an interesting dynamic because although in market cap terms or fully diluted terms, something may be overvalued. We've seen many times in the crypto market, and theoretically the stock market is no different, where you'll see big squeezes to the upside in the early days as, a lot of demand comes onto the market and there simply isn't that much supply. And then eventually you will start to see price trade to the downside, or you will see capped upside or price discovery eventually as the unlocks start to hit. And with SpaceX, if we actually look at the data behind the float, we could see 4.25% is the base IPO float. And if you look at the unlock schedule, you have the first unlocks hitting post Q2 earnings. So the base unlock is 20% with a 30% performance trigger. And then you have unlocks vesting over time over a 70-day, 90-day, 105-day, and 120 and a 135-day period. So the majority of the 7% tranches are happening between the 70 and the 135-day period, which is the period, as you can see here, where you are likely to see a bit more sell pressure coming onto the market. And because a lot of these investors got in at extremely attractive valuations, it is likely that we are going to see some sell pressure. That being said, in the early days, just like those low float high FDV crypto tokens that we've seen for the past few years, there isn't going to be as much sell pressure and there's very little float on the market. So I do think shorting this becomes a dangerous game. In fact, I would say shorting this is a non-starter. And of course, this is all just my personal opinion, but I think in the early days, the only trade I'm personally looking for are longs. And then I'll potentially look to short sell, even though I don't like it as much as a strategy, as the unlocks do start to hit. Of course, the market will start to price this in ahead of time, which is why I do think the best strategy with SpaceX is becoming a momentum trader. So looking for momentum in either direction and playing off momentum. Generally with things like this and generally with stocks in general though, you want to play the long side more than the short side, because if you're bearish on something, typically you will just be waiting for price to reset to get an entry as opposed to naked short selling, which I do find quite risky in equities in general because the market can just, remain irrational for much longer than you can remain solvent. And other analysts in the space have also anticipated, look, in the early days, as Ben Cowan says, there probably will be a surge in price on launch or, in the few days following launch, and then maybe a big pullback after the initial hype wears off. And it's not just hype, because this does coincide with the vesting schedule, which, gradually starts to kick in post Q2 earnings, day 70 up until day 135. You see a relatively linear unlock schedule, and then it accelerates a little bit post Q3 earnings. Of course, there can be more unlocks brought forward if they actually exceed earnings. So I'm also aligned with Cowan in the sense that my bias, and of course I will just be trading the chart, but my bias is that the early days of price action could be positive, or the early weeks of price action, and then I do think it is going to struggle to find price discovery just due to the sheer amount of unlocks that are going to kick in. You see the quote here, SpaceX's IPO at 1.77 trill, but only 4.3% of shares will trade initially. That limited float could drive strong early demand and volatility while making true price discovery difficult. And I truly agree with that. All right, now let's get into how I'm actually thinking about trading SpaceX, and then I'll get into what I think the broader ramifications on the market are. But before then, I'm just going to go and select some Noti Gang winners. Obviously, if you comment on my videos, you stand a chance to win $100. So Cape, you win $100. Hassoni, you win $100. Aylin, you win $100. Nicola, you win $100. I'm going to scroll down even more to keep it fair. And Seb Roper, you win $100. Email the giveaways email below. And if you didn't win today, comment on this video, Noti Gang, or really anything, and I'll just select a few more people in the next video as usual. So thanks all of you guys for supporting my content. We've got some bangers dropping. The video tomorrow is an absolute banger. It's basically my AI trading strategy around IPOs in general, and specifically SpaceX. At the end of this video, I'll give you a sneak peek of my architecture, and tomorrow we're going to dive deep into that. So do make sure you're subscribed to the channel. All right, let's talk about how I'm looking at trading SpaceX. Well, right now, I'm actually not looking at trading SpaceX. I think it's too risky to trade day one. I think if you are positioning, as I said, you have to more so look for longs than shorts. But for me personally, and this is just general advice in the entire market, I only like to take trades where I can define a clear upside and a clear downside. So before I take any trade, I look at what is my maximum loss and what is my possible gain on the trade. And then I can calibrate a risk reward framing, which helps me justify whether it's worth taking the risk. And I actually created this risk reward calculator here. You can create one on Claude in your own time. And what you can essentially do is every time you enter a trade, you can enter your ideal entry price, your stop loss, your upside target, and your position size. And it will tell you what your max loss is and what your risk reward is on any trade. And although this is really simple, it's so overlooked in the market. Like, just knowing what your maximum loss is actually completely frees you to trade freely, because you understand, all right, I'm putting $1,000 in, my max loss is $200. So worst case, I walk away with $800, but best case, I walk away with $1,000 profit. And then it's really easy to take risk because you know exactly what your parameters are. So that's why I recommend when you're trading, you actually look at the chart and, you know, let's say SpaceX dipped down to this 162 point. This is where technical analysis comes in and really shines, even if you have a fundamental reading on a token or on a stock. So let's say you want to get an entry at 162. You probably want to set your stop either below the prior local low, or if you're trying to be a bit more flexible with your trade, you might have another stop below the ultimate low, the ultimate local low. So then you can basically look at, okay, if I'm entering at 162, and I'll actually put it into the calculator to show you the entry, 162, and then let's say we put our stop loss down here at 151. So it'll start to calculate this in a second. And we have our upside target at the resistance level at 191. Then it basically calculates a risk reward of 2.64. This is actually very, very good. Typically, you want to look for a risk reward of 2 or above. So 2.64 is actually very good because you have the 191 target, you have the 162 entry, and your stop is at 151. And if that position was $10,000, it's going to calculate the profit at 1.7 and the max loss at the stop of 679. And of course, you know, you can create calculators with leverage and more sliders if you want to make it more complex. But I just think this is a really good practice whenever you go into a trade, not only a short-term trade, but also long-term buys, just understanding what is your invalidation. And if you did have a price invalidation, how much would that actually cost you? And making sure before you go into any trade, you're very aware of how much it could cost you. I feel like my worst trades, and maybe a lot of your worst trades, have come when you haven't really defined downside and you've just let a position bleed and bleed and bleed and bleed. So especially when it comes to trading new launches or trading low time frame, I think it's really important to define your risk reward. So that's just a practice that I will regularly do. Now let's go back to SpaceX. In terms of valuation, I do feel like it feels inflated. I mean, obviously it's low float, so it slightly muddies the picture. But if you actually go through and look at some of the data, it's trading at it's trading above 94.5x sales. It's trading at 268x EBITDA. These are crazy numbers. So essentially the market is pricing in an extremely strong compounded annual growth rate. Like, you would likely need a 30 to 60% compounded annual growth rate to justify the current valuations. And look, with a stock like SpaceX, it's definitely possible. It has massive TAM if it could potentially, you know, revolutionize or commercialize space travel. Clearly that is massive. Obviously the satellite infrastructure is, you know, a big thing for them as well. And in the future, we may see Tesla Tesla merge into SpaceX. So clearly there's lots of potential. And as I'll get into later in the video, I'm actually interested to develop a long-term position in SpaceX, but at current valuations, like we can't sit here and say it's cheap, or we can't sit here and say it's a no-brainer. So my strategy right now will not be positioning for the long term based on current price action. I do feel like, as Ben Cowan points out, and as the data points out around when some of the unlocks are coming, later in the year, we actually may see better entries in terms of building a long-term position. But I'll circle back to that soon. I want to talk about the impact on the market overall. So in terms of crypto, firstly, the narrative that I've seen floating around is that it's basically going to suck liquidity out of crypto. I personally think that's nonsense. I don't think any serious market participant of crypto, whether you're in Bitcoin, Solana, or whatever, is going to sell Bitcoin to enter SpaceX, especially because investors with a lot of capital, whales, they're typically slightly smarter, not everyone, but a lot of them are smarter, and a lot of them will not want to be buying in or FOMOing into the hype. I think maybe retail might FOMO into the hype, but retail don't move this market. Bitcoin is largely institutionally led. I mean, guys like Michael Saylor aren't selling their Bitcoin to buy SpaceX. I think there is a valid concern that it could potentially suck some liquidity out of major stocks, because there are other stocks on the NASDAQ where people might consolidate into SpaceX. And of course, there is a natural rebasing with the index. It's not in the S&P 500 yet, but the broader NASDAQ index to consolidate MSCI into SpaceX, which results in a bit of a liquidity squeeze across the rest of the market. So although you may see NASDAQ actually holding up in terms of the index valuation, you may see some individual stocks dipping. So I think the risk is more for other major equities, and it's not necessarily for crypto itself. In fact, it absolutely makes no sense in my opinion. But we have seen in crypto, the trend of when a hot token launches, it can suck liquidity out of other altcoins. So this may be something that happens in the equity market, but it's not something, in my opinion, that is going to affect Bitcoin itself. Basically, what's happening is MSCI is getting an expedited entry of SpaceX, but the S&P 500 inclusion requires profitability. So when that comes later, clearly there'll be a massive bid for SpaceX, and there already is passive buying from day one, which is obviously one of the bullish narratives around SpaceX. But I do think due to the lack of S&P 500 yet, that is going to slightly limit the temperament on this, and that's one of the reasons why I'd be more hesitant to base, a bullish strategy purely off index buying. I think it's more the general hype and more the low float that would be the driving factors towards potential upside for SpaceX. Overall, in terms of how I think it affects equities, and I want to make it clear this is, just my opinion based on my take, I don't think it necessarily is indicative of a local top in the shorter term. I think there are many other factors at play with the market, geopolitical rates, so many other factors. Obviously, SpaceX could potentially contribute to the hype, the frenzy, the euphoria that typically can lead to blow-off tops in the market, but I don't think in and of itself it will trigger that. Later in the year, it does become interesting when these bigger unlocks start to hit alongside a potential OpenAI IPO, alongside a potential Anthropic IPO, which could happen even sooner. Do all of these culminate in a liquidity event which can see real potential downside for equities? Maybe, but I don't think alone that's going to be the trigger. I think you would need other things. For example, rates continue to rise, Fed gets more hawkish, CapEx concerns start to grow, maybe something starts cracking in private credit. That is probably the broader storm you're looking for if you're a stock market bear, or if you want to get entries on the stock market, which, to be honest, is me. I would love a dip in the stock market to get entries. And that's something that is in my framework. I do think at some point we're going to get a deeper correction in equities. The market's already started to come down a little bit, but I do think, although it's still looking relatively strong, at some point we could have a leg to the downside, and SpaceX could be a contributor, although I think it's unlikely to, trigger a local top in and of itself, which is, a really basic narrative that I see flying around the internet. Now, in terms, as I mentioned earlier in the video, of SpaceX as a longer term hold, I still think SpaceX is one of the more asymmetric opportunities in the world. I mean, you can't really bet against Elon. They have rockets, Starlink, XAI, all under one roof. Tesla is likely to come into that next year as well, based on the information that we're getting. So I'm personally interested in being a holder over a multi-decade period, but I'm almost certain there is a bigger downturn that could facilitate a longer term entry for me without having to FOMO into the market right now on IPO. And even if it means that, the token trades higher and, let's say it squeezes, a bit to the upside in the interim before coming down and consolidating, I'll just look for a nice base being formed when the market isn't euphoric, when, the market isn't jittery, when these unlocks hit the market. And even if I pay a slight premium versus today's price, I get to do so with a lot more certainty and slowly build a longer term position. Of course, there are still concerns concerns over the valuation, as I discussed. Of course, they are going to need some really strong earnings growth to justify the valuation, but it is an asymmetric bet, which I am personally going to be making over the longer term. But that entry is not going to come today. That's going to come later in the year. And for now, I'm focusing on setups on SpaceX that actually present decent risk reward, as I am across the entire market. So looking at individual positions on their own individual merit. Now, tomorrow, I'm going to be dropping a very good video. I'm going to show you how to create an AI research agent to study IPOs, an alert system which plugs into that to get alerts when there are major IPOs or trading opportunities coming, a valuation model to evaluate automatically using Claude IPOs, and the overall AI architecture that I'm now starting to apply to equities, because I've basically been working on building scrapers that automatically scrape X, help me get opportunities across crypto and equities, and building a recursive learning system, especially with the new launch of Claude Fable, that gets smarter over time and actually facilitates me to become a better investor. So I did my, basic financial dashboard video. The next build tomorrow is going to be a video specifically on IPOs and specifically on equities research. So if you do want that, make sure to subscribe and turn notifications on. It's going to be an amazing video. And I hope today was able to help you out in terms of your thinking around SpaceX, but obviously come to your own conclusions. If you do want a chance to win $100, just comment Noti Gang below and I'll be selecting some winners in the next market update. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Peace out.